Welcome to part 2, our 3-part series in connection to religious pluralism in Gauḍīya Vedānta. This series of videos, short videos, are accompanying an actual series of articles that are being published in my website, Padmanabha.com. And these are brief elaborations or brief explanations, summarized explanations for those who may not have the time to go through the detailed articles with the corresponding quotes and references and so on. But if you are interested in seeing the article, please, you can find them in the description of this video. So today we're in part 2, holding the personal and the impersonal in one embrace. In part 1, we explored the notion of polymorphic monotheism and how the Gauḍīya Vedānta, the devotional mystical tradition of Sri Chaitanya, acknowledges one non-dual infinite expressing himself, herself, themselves in endless manifestations, and different practitioners or devotees or lovers of the divine approaching the divine accordingly. But today we are addressing the notion of beyond monotheism, beyond polymorphic monotheism, the notion of personalism or monotheism and monism or impersonalism. Which is the relationship between Gauḍīya Vedānta as a monotheistic, polymorphic monotheistic tradition and Advaita Vedānta, what sometimes is called radical non-dualism, which ultimately proposes the doctrine of monism. Essentially, everything ultimately is one in every single sense of the term, at least if we understand Advaita Vedānta from that perspective. So there are different notions of non-dualism to begin with. Sometimes Advaita Vedānta is described as a non-dual tradition, and it is. But sometimes we over-identify only Advaita Vedānta as a non-dual tradition, while actually every genuine mystical tradition is a non-dual tradition, as I try to explain in the chapter on non-dual thinking in my book, Radical Personalism. So every Vedantic school must affirm some form of non-duality, as we find in Ramanujacharya's Vishistadvaita, the Shuddhadvaita, the Dvaita Dvaita school, in our tradition, Achintya Veda Ved. While in contrast to that, Shankaracharya, the founder of what we will call nowadays Advaita Vedanta, his non-dualism could be called radical non-dualism, because if understood literally, the proposal is ultimately only Brahman is true, only the absolute exists. Everything else, our sense of individuality, the sense of a personal God, the loving interaction between the two, this world of matter, nature, all that is not real ultimately. So that's why it's called radical non-dualism. Gauḍīya Vedānta and other monotheistic non-dual schools, we could call them, I will call them nuanced non-dualism. Still there is non-duality. In our tradition, the Bhagavad Purana will make that very clear by describing reality as advaya-jñāna, advaya-jñāna tattva. Reality is non-dual consciousness, which expresses itself in diverse ways, again, polymorphic. So everything is non-dual, everything is related, interrelated, interconnected, revolving around a common center. Nothing exists in isolation of that common center. In that sense, everything is non-dual, everything belongs to a common center. But there's the principle of relationality. That union is expressed through relationship. At least that's the approach of a monotheistic or relational, devotional school. And on top of that, at least in our tradition, Gauḍīya Vedānta will argue, for us, bhakti, devotion, loving devotion, is both the means and the goal. So you cannot get more non-dual than that. What we are already doing is that very thing we want to do for eternity. In other schools, we will see the sadhana or the practice differs considerably from the sadhya or the goal to be attained through the practice. We do something in order to attain something else. But in bhakti, we are already doing what we want to continue to do for eternity. So in that sense, it's a non-dual. There's no difference between the means and the final attainment. Practice and goal are the same, love and relationship itself. So for us, non-duality is fulfilled in the union of love, not necessarily in dissolution, absolute dissolution of difference, absolute elimination of individuality, which we will argue is not possible in our tradition according to verses of the Gita, like Bhagavad Gita 12:12, where Krishna is saying to Arjuna, there was never a time where I did not exist, where you did not exist, where all of these people did not exist. We have all existed since time without beginning. And the implication is as the unique individuals that we are, and that's why Krishna is saying me, you, and everyone else. So that's the notion of non-duality according to the Gauḍīya Vedānta. Reality is advaya-jñāna tattva, non-dual substance expressed in different ways. And we can, another word to refer to that will be panentheism. Not that everything is God, but everything exists in God and God exists in everything. So that type of non-duality affirms unity and affirms distinction at the same time. Bhed, abed. Bhed, abed. Panentheism. Everything God, God in everything, in relational terms. Everything exists in relationship, in dialogue with everything else. And for us, of course, while speaking about diversity, relationship, and love, non-duality is equally important, because if we overemphasize diversity, we end up seeing this polymorphic monotheism, these endless phases of the divine, in polytheistic terms. We end up with many gods, which that's not the idea. And if we push out too much only the unity principle without the diversity, we may end up with something like radical non-dualism, like there's only Brahman, there's no individuality, no relationships, and so on, which is not what Gauḍīya Vedānta is about, basically. So for us, unity, proper unity, safeguards multiplicity. On the foundation of interconnectedness, we have actual reasons to have something in common and relate on a very deep level. So that's it. What happens then with Advaita Vedanta and Gauḍīya Vedānta, or with impersonalism and personalism? Do they need to be at war with each other? Do they need to cancel one another? Or is there a place for both the impersonal and the personal? And the answer is yes. There is place for both. There is place. Again, the Bhagavān will say, Brahmeti Paramātmeti Bhagavaniti Shabdite. Reality is advaya-jñāna, non-dual consciousness, and expresses itself in forms like Brahman, Paramātmā, and Bhagavān. Impersonal divine, localized divine, transcendent personal divine. So God has his feature, which is without qualities, without perceivable qualities, and his qualityless and his qualityful feature. Nirguna saguna, if we want to use these terms, which of course are understood differently in different traditions. Today I'm talking from the perspective of Gauḍīya Vedānta. So we find different statements in the scriptures, in the Upanishads, speaking at times God has no ears, no eyes, no hands, no senses, and then we will find some other who say sarva kama, sarva everything. He has all desires, all thoughts, all sense, all smell, all touch, all sight. So the idea is both of them are there. Some people may be, for particular reasons and some scars acquired, be called and inclined to the impersonal realization or experience, and some others to the personal one. So there are other traditions, interestingly, and I referred to that in my article, other Vaishnava traditions, other monotheistic traditions, like teachers like Madhva Ramanuja, that generally, at least at large and clearly in their teachings, they seem not to accept the possibility of an eternal residence, so to say, or merging in the impersonal absolute, while Gaudiya Vaishnavism acknowledges that possibility. You can attain that type of non-differentiated experience. We will argue, though, you will never lose your individuality because the soul is eternally individual, but you can lose your identification or sense of that individuality by full identification with the impersonal absolute. So Gaudiya Vedanta attempts to reject both extremes. Again, radical impersonalism or radical non-dualism, only Brahman is real, everything else is basically false. Or a type of toxic personalism, let's put it that way, in my opinion, which is Brahman does not exist, only the personal exists, only ultimately my God exists many times, right? So the attainment of Brahman is valid, is mentioned in our tradition, is one of the 5 forms of mukti or liberation, sometimes called ekatva, oneness, kaivalya, another form of saying oneness, exclusiveness, sayuja, a form of merging, So Bhagavatam clearly makes this differentiation between personalistic types of liberation like Salokya, Sarupya, Sayuja, Sarshti, and so on, and Sayuja, or Ekatva, or Kaivalya. So if something is mukti, that's an eternal situation, basically. We cannot call something mukti and then fall from that situation, because sometimes there is this confusion among even members of our tradition. No, if you reach Brahman, the impersonal absolute, you have to fall from there. But then you cannot call that situation mukti, because mukti, by definition, muktir hitvanyatarupa swarupena bhyabhyastiti, indicates a permanent situation in transcendence. So we cannot fall from mukti. If not, we cannot call that mukti. And if something is beyond the influence of the gunas, as we will call, beyond the influence of material nature, what can make you fall from there? So again, we all argue the individuality of the soul cannot be destroyed, but can be eclipsed in oneness, in that type of oneness. Because at the same time, again, as I quoted Bhagavad Gita 2:12, or even chapter 15, verse 7, Mamai Vamsa Jivaluke Jiva Bhuta Sanatana. Krishna says, the souls are my eternal part and parcels, or fragmented parts, whatever, amsa, whatever, however you may like to translate that. So he's indicated Sanatana. There is an eternality to the individuality of each one of us. But that doesn't cancel the possibility of deep identification with Brahman, the impersonal absolute in this case, if we understand Brahman as such, as an eternal possibility. So again, we don't need to criticize that, though it may not be the cup of tea of a bhakta, of someone pursuing the path of loving devotion. Now, someone could bring some arguments. There are verses in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Bhagavad Purana 10:2-32, Aruhya Krichena Parampadam Tata, and so on, which seem to indicate those who are reach that level of impersonal realization fall from there. But that verse clearly speaks about Bhimukta Manina, those who consider themselves liberated, but they are not actually. And they are offending bhakti, offending God in his personal form, considering that false, and that makes them fall from their so-called situation of liberation, at least they think in themselves so. Now, if we go on to the original founder of Advaita Vedanta, Shankaracharya, and if you read that literally, yeah, he's clear about that in many of his commentaries, as I quote in my article, especially in his main writings, which are his commentary Sarikavashya, his commentary on the Vedanta Sutra. He will basically reduce Ishvara, or the personal God, to an upadhi, to a limiting adjunct, to a false designation, to illusion tied to ignorance. And from that perspective, reading that from that way, yeah, Gauḍīya Vedānta will reject that view, basically that stand, but will reinterpret Shankara's mission within the context of divine providence, let's say. So we are not deeply, heavily criticizing Shankara, but seeing him, as Sri Chaitanya did, our founder, from a broader picture that fits what scripture describes as well. Because, for example, Sri Chaitanya Dev, many times he faced Advaitins, and sometimes he will present his objections to some of the points raised by Shankar, but at the same time he will say there's no fault in what he did, because he was carrying the order of Ishvara. And that's when we go to texts like Padma Purana, where Shiva describes himself as incarnating as Shankar, as a Brahman, to spread what he will be called Baal Buddhism or Advaita Vedanta for some particular cosmic purpose. As it's understood, Buddha stopped unnecessary sacrifice of animals in the names of the Vedas by dismissing the Veda altogether. Shankara reintroduced the Veda into the collective mind of the time, but without giving the full-fledged possibilities of all that the Veda is given, and just concentrating on one particular direction, Advaita Vedanta. So in this way, Gauḍiyas are as understanding as they can, I will say, and I'm not saying that trying to be biased toward my own tradition, but we will try to understand Shankar despite his radical statements when read literally about only Brahman is real and everything is false, that can be even insulting for some, trying to understand the mission of Shankar in a bigger picture. And if Shankaracharya is Shiva, as is described in Padma Purana, then we in our tradition will say Vaishnavanam Jata Sambho. Shiva is the greatest Vaishnav. So we all see Shankaracharya as a Vaishnav who is fulfilling a particular purpose, a particular mission. Shankaracharya himself is showing his devotional inclinations, we will say now, from our perspective. Again, I'm talking from the Gaudiya Vedanta's perspective. I'm sure Shankara's followers in Advaita Vedanta will have a different view of this. But again, we can make a case with strong scriptural foundations. We have many hymns composed by Shankaracharya, Bhaja Govindam, written at the very end of his life. Bhaja Govindam, Mudhamati Samprapti Sani Hittikale, Nahi Nahi Rakshati Dukring Karane. Like advising his followers and the world, please don't make play of words, don't get entangled in your mind and logic, just worship Govinda, just worship Govinda. Clearly devotional. Again, so we will feel, okay, here is Shiva's greatest Vaishnav, revealing who he actually is, and again, having to fulfill a particular mission according to time, place, and circumstance. So these are a few thoughts in connection to the content of my second article of this three-part series, in this case about the impersonal and the personal, and how Gaudiya Vedanta holds together both of them, acknowledging the possibility of the impersonal dimension, realization, the ultimate situation in transcendence, while at the same time that may not be our preferred choice, and at the same time trying to understand Shankara's radical statements in a more nuanced way by seeing a bigger picture of his background as mission as Shiva, performing a particular purpose at time, place, and circumstance. So that's another way of embracing and consuming this notion of Gaudiya Vedanta's Achintya Bheda Ved, embracing simultaneous unity and diversity, which could be also include personalism and impersonalism. So in our next and last third part of our series, both in the article and in the video, we'll be extending this exploration in connection to the notion of Brahman and Bhagavān, which, as we have shown, have both their place in the mind of Gaudiya Vedanta, but still sometimes the argument may come, okay, you may acknowledge both Brahman and Bhagavān, impersonal and personal, but still it seems from Gaudiya traditions, scriptures, and teachers that there is a hierarchy when Bhagavān is seen as superior, Brahman as inferior, Brahman as subservient, ontologically dependent on the ultimate personal absolute. Is that true or not? No. Does this all make Brahman or the impersonal dimension lesser? Are there other ways in which we can read this reality? We'll address those topics and more in our third and final article and video. Thanks for your time. See you next week for that.